LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the June 14th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. This week I have the 16 best, most newsworthy clips that I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary for you all tonight. 16 clips. If you want to see my clip list that I use, my notes to myself of the 16 clips, there's a link down in the video description where you can look at a copy of this list I'm looking at myself here. And they're on the two topics, mostly on the first topic of cops, discussing defunding versus reforming of police, the issue of qualified immunity, which is a legal issue. I am a lawyer, so I will be committing some legal analysis when I talk about qualified immunity, and I'll also be talking about the Democrats' Justice and Policing Act. And then the second topic, only a few clips at the end, on COVID-19, discussing the spikes in cases and hospitalizations in many states that could be resulting from coronavirus complacency. And I have both Dash and Sandy in here. I don't know if you just heard Sandy whining there. And then Dash is right behind the camera. Hopefully he won't push it over. But I do have a 42-second Dash and Sandy clip, or Dandy clip, as some people like to call it, for the dog and cat fans out there. But first I want to show you a political comedy clip on the first topic. This is from Meet the Press. It's either showing our joke of a president, or maybe the cosmic joke that at this time of, awakening about racism in our country, we have the worst president in recent memory able to take advantage of this moment. And that's something that Chuck Todd shows with two Trump clips, one recent and one that's like 30 years old, that I will discuss with you after we watch them together. During his panel discussion, he showed these over here.
Helene, the question is whether the president, whether he can play a role that's constructive here or not. I want to play, first I want to play two excerpts from the president. One just this week to Fox News about Abe Lincoln. Take a listen.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln, because he did good, although it's always questionable. In other words, the end result.
Well, we are free, Mr. President.
But we
he
are
did
free.
pretty well.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no,
so I'm going to take a pass on Abe, Honest Abe, as we call him.
And Helene, before you respond, I want to also play, because I think one of the challenges for this president is that this has been a long history of having one view about race. Listen to this quote from 1989.
A well-educated black has a tremendous advantage over a well-educated white in terms of the job market. If I were starting off today, I would love to be a well-educated black, because I really believe they do have an actual advantage today.
It's sort of a similar question I had to Tim Scott is can the president, because of his history, even his recent instincts here, can he play a constructive role without sort of acknowledging views that he had in the past that no longer seem to be mainstream?
So yeah, those two clips there. The second, what I find interesting about those two clips is that both of them are kind of like mainstream views in the Republican Party. I remember there was a poll was it a few months ago, several weeks back, that showed Republicans actually were willing to say that Trump was the best president was a better president than Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know what he was trying to say in that clip. But then also that whole thing like reverse racism is worse than racism. That's been for many years a core belief of Republicans. So I guess that's why Trump did so well in the Republican Party, because he has some of these core racist or racialist, or the beliefs themselves are kind of racist. You have to admit that, and whether that makes him a racist or about the whole racism issue, it just shows that he is really ill-prepared to be the president at this time when the country, because of various factors, is really confronting racism. And that was the main topic covered by all of the Sunday morning news analysis shows. The racism and the problems with policing and reforming the police and defunding the police and, like I said, qualified immunity. There was a little bit of coverage of COVID-19, which has kind of slipped off the radar and I think is about to become a bigger story again for reasons you'll see when I get to that second topic. I'm actually going to start with the CBS News Face of the Nation news summary because I think they did the best job of fitting COVID-19 into their news summary. That there's a brief introduction from Margaret Brennan, then a report from Mark Strassman, who you may remember from weeks back. I haven't shown a Mark Strassman clip for a while, but it talks about what happened in Atlanta over the weekend. It talks about the general protest situation. It doesn't really hold Trump that accountable for some of his more ridiculous statements, but overall I think it was the best news summary, and I will talk about it with you a little more after we watch Margaret Brennan and Mark Strassman from CBS News' Face the Nation this morning summarize the news over here.
The nation. After 19 straight days and nights of outrage following the death of George Floyd, a weary and emotionally drained America has settled into a trifecta of crises affecting every part of our culture and society. We will continue to bring you all the news on all three fronts as the race to contain the coronavirus, to repair our devastated economy, and to fix systemic racism keeps moving. CBS News national correspondent Mark Strassman begins our coverage today from Atlanta.
Atlanta, known as the city too busy to hate, was in turmoil overnight. Protesters enraged by another deadly police shooting took to the streets. They blocked a stretch of downtown interstate, confronted by dozens of police in riot gear. Atlanta was burning. Some protesters torched this Wendy's, where the shooting took place. On Friday night, 2 white Atlanta police officers wrestled with Rayshard Brooks after he failed a sobriety field test. He grabbed one of their tasers and ran. The second officer chased him, firing his taser. Seconds later, off camera, you hear what sounds like 3 gunshots. The 27-year-old Brooks died at the hospital. Investigators say he had turned around and pointed a taser at the officer chasing him, and the officer shot him. Within 24 hours, Atlanta's police chief resigned, and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms called for the officer to be fired.
There is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do.
Officer Devin Brosnan was terminated. His partner Garrett Rolfe was suspended. It's the latest deadly moment that explains this: Saturday's march in Los Angeles and another in Washington, D.C. In all 50 states, protesters demand a vaccine for America's other killer virus, racism. Police chokeholds, police budgets, police attitudes, all under review. But expect a fight.
To then demonize police officers as if we're the problem, as if we broke the window, as if we caused the violence. That is absolutely outrageous.
Another familiar battleground. Confederate symbols keep falling, like rebel soldiers at Pickett's charge. NASCAR banned the rebel flag. Confederate statues toppled or vandalized across the South. But as crowds clamor for an American renewal, there's a new health worry. In at least 20 states, new COVID cases are rising. Experts see a potential health threat in crowds of protesters shoulder to shoulder, shouting. Back in Atlanta, Chris Stewart is the lawyer for Rayshard Brooks' family.
I can even say we want justice, but I don't even care anymore. I don't even know what that is.
This is the Wendy's where the original confrontation took place. This city is bracing for another round of protests tonight. Atlanta is smoldering, just like this restaurant. Margaret?
Mark Strassman, thanks. We go now to Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and Republican Senator Tim Scott. Good morning to you, Senator.
And I will have a clip of Tim Scott. You see, I have a live. I told you Dash was in here with me. So here you have. I've never done this before, but I've gotten a hold of Dash here. Dash has knocked down my clip list. I'm letting Dash go. Sandy's lying down over there. I don't know why Dash is moving around like this, but. Oh, and thank you to Matthew. I saw that I got a super chat contribution from Matthew, and also Sexy Bob there. Wow. Off to a good start from Sexy Bob, $20. Thank you. And then Matthew asking if this is a new shirt. No, for my longtime viewers, you know, this is a shirt that I've worn many times before. I usually wear it in the fall because it's kind of fall colors. But anyway, I was running low on shirts. This is not a new shirt. Although I have heard that Hawaiian-style shirts are like a signature of the alt-right, like the white supremacist people, the boogaloos or whatever wear Hawaiian shirts. That is kind of freaked me out a little because I like Hawaiian silk shirt type prints, and I don't think that I should let that be appropriated by the right wing, the alt-right white supremacists. But anyway, I did like that news summary there. Although, did you notice like a minute from the end, was that like Henry Winkler, who was being all pro-cop? No, it was this guy who's the head of the police union in New York, who was saying all sorts of ridiculous things about how cops are the real victims here and how any sort of accountability makes cops' jobs impossible, which is ridiculous. But I want to move on to my next news summary here from ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I think this was the second best news summary. I don't know. I actually have the news summaries almost in order of longest to shortest, but in the ABC News This Week... Oh, dropped my clip link, my clip list here, but the ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary, they talk about what's happening in New York and New Jersey. They talk about the streets of America having protests every night since the George Floyd incident, and talks about Atlanta, talks about the NFL, talks about reforms, and also what's going on globally. Even all around the world there are protests, and I will talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. The streets of America have seen protests every night since the killing of George Floyd nearly 3 weeks ago, in cities large and small, from New York to Beverly Hills. And overnight, a new police shooting has drawn outrage in Atlanta.
I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force.
The chief of police has resigned. A police officer fired after shooting and killing a black man. Authorities are now reviewing this video of the violent struggle. The shooting, sadly, not new. Such a swift response certainly is. Under pressure, society changing fast. The big question, will it last? In New York and New Jersey, police chokeholds banned.
This is the moment to put forth a real federal reform justice agenda.
Louisville, Kentucky passed Breonna's law to stop the use of no-knock warrants. And those first police reforms, just one sign of a striking cultural shift. Merriam-Webster revising the definition of racism. The Oscars have added a diversity requirement for eligibility. White fragility, and So You Want to Talk About Race topped the New York Times bestseller list as the NFL apologizes for past mistakes.
We, the National Football League, admit we were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest.
And now the protest movement has gone global. Thousands marching in France. In South Korea, this Black Lives Matter banner at the U.S. Embassy. And in England, protesters toppled this statue of a 17th century slave trader, as Confederate statues are torn down here at home. And with the election just 5 months away, President Trump is struggling for a consistent response, promising reforms at public forums, threatening to send troops into the streets, attacking protesters with inflammatory tweets. And on Friday, this startling claim.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln because he did good, although it's always questionable.
And we are joined now by the President's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben.
And I don't have any Ben Carson clips. I didn't think anything he said was worth clipping, but you saw George Stephanopoulos at the end of his news summary there did show that I did the best of anyone except maybe Lincoln in that last clip, and then there was some questioning of what Lincoln did, and the way that's been interpreted by, I guess, the majority of people is that he's not he's questioning maybe he's better than Lincoln, maybe he's not, but it actually makes me think of some of the things that people on the right say about how, like, blacks were better off under slavery. Maybe emancipation wasn't so great for blacks. That's an argument I hear from crazy people on the right, and I don't know if that might be what Trump was really meant. It's hard to tell from the context of that clip that I also showed at the beginning of the program. But I thought generally that was a better... that was a good news summary. One thing I forgot to mention about the Face the Nation news summary, and most of the news summaries emphasize, like this next one, the NBC News Meet the Press news summary, also emphasizes how Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, reacted much more quickly than people normally react. The shooting in Atlanta was just on Friday, and the police chief resigned, and the officer who did the shooting was fired, and that is really quick for the United States. But I think one of the reasons is because I've also seen other stories, and even on one of the Sunday morning news analysis shows, they did a story about who the Joe Biden vice president picks might be. I didn't take clips of that, but one of them is Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, and I think that she's trying to show how she's very proactive and quick to respond to police overuse of force, and that may be why she was so quick to do that, because she's on the vice presidential shortlist. But that is actually one of the things mentioned in this much shorter than usual NBC News Meet the Press news summary. It just is Chuck Todd's introduction, then he goes over to this reporter, and I'm not going to show that report. She seemed to spend too much time on her ability to smell the smoke still from the smoldering Wendy's that was set on fire last night. But anyway, I will talk about all of that a little more after we watch that 1-minute news summary at the beginning of NBC News' Meet the Press this morning over here.
Another fatal shooting of an African-American man at the hands of police, this time in Atlanta, has led to renewed protests and the resignation of that city's police chief. This happened Friday night at a Wendy's restaurant when police shot and killed Rayshard Brooks after Brooks had failed a sobriety test, fought with police officers, and was running away with one of the officers' taser guns. As news spread, protesters took to the streets, blocking an interstate, and the Wendy's itself was set on fire. Atlanta's mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, moved quickly, firing the police officer who fired the fatal shots, and announcing that Police Chief Erica Shields was stepping down.
I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force and have called for the immediate termination of the officer.
The second officer involved has been placed on administrative duty. Our own Blaine Alexander is in Atlanta at the Wendy's restaurant where all this took place for us this morning. And Blaine...
And like I said, I'm not going to show you that report, but one thing I noticed when I showed the CBS News Face the Nation news summary, when I originally flagged that, I thought, one of the things they didn't mention, even though they talked about, Mark Strassman talked about what happened in Atlanta, they didn't mention how the guy who was killed was originally just sleeping in his car, fell asleep in his car in the Wendy's drive-thru, maybe because he had too much to drink, probably because he had too much to drink, but asleep in his car was his original status, and that doesn't seem to be a status that should end up with dead. And asleep in the car didn't show up in the Face the Nation news summary. The ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary didn't end up in the NBC News one either. I don't know if it made it in any of them, although you'll see in some of the newsmaker interviews where you'll see people bring that up. But the next news summary is from CNN's State of the Union, where Jake Tapper always starts off saying, what is the State of the Union this week? And this week it's demanding change. He talks about what happened in Atlanta, and he also talks about some of the Trump misconduct or Trump questionable conduct, scheduling a rally in Tulsa, the site of one of the worst massacre of African Americans, blacks in U.S. history, the Black Wall Street thing from 1921 that, if you're a fan of Watchmen on HBO, that was in the first episode. They reenacted the Tulsa Massacre, and he scheduled it on Juneteenth. One of the things I notice is when they mention Juneteenth on these shows, they say it's the anniversary of emancipation, but it's actually not the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the anniversary of when Union soldiers made it to Texas to let the last slaves in 1865 at the end of the Civil War know that they weren't slaves anymore. So it's 2.5 years after emancipation that the last slaves in the Confederacy finally found out that they had been emancipated. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch Jake Tapper on CNN's State of the Union this morning over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is demanding change. We begin with breaking news out of Atlanta: violence and protesters, and dozens arrested after another black man was killed by a white policeman. The facts of the case are under investigation right now, but we know that Rayshard Brooks, 27, was shot and killed outside a Wendy's drive-thru after a struggle with police. The head of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has said that Brooks fired one of the officers' tasers at them, then turned, presumably to flee, after which he was shot and killed. The mayor of Atlanta has said this was not a justified use of force by police. Within 24 hours, Atlanta's police chief has stepped down, and the officer who killed Brooks has been fired. But the swift action has not been enough to quell the anger, the fear, and the frustration reverberating across the country and throughout Atlanta. One protester overnight telling CNN, quote, "I thought the message was clear, but obviously we're still not heard," unquote. This news comes as President Trump beats a rare retreat, rescheduling his return to the campaign trail in Tulsa, Oklahoma, originally scheduled for Juneteenth, Emancipation Day. Still not clear what role the White House would play in policing reforms that are sweeping the nation and gaining momentum on Capitol Hill, as lawmakers on both sides of the aisle work on legislation to address a demand for change that only appears to be growing. Joining me now to discuss this, the House Democratic Whip, Congressman Jim Clyburn of...
And I will have a clip of Jim Clyburn, congressman from South Carolina, who may have been instrumental in getting former Vice President Joe Biden the Democratic nomination, since he endorsed him, and South Carolina definitely shifted where the race was going, sort of pushed it towards Joe Biden from Bernie Sanders. And as you might expect, Jim Clyburn, just like Joe Biden, is against defunding the police, and I'll have a few clips on defunding the police. Stacey Abrams, Ilhan Omar, and James Clyburn all talking about what that means. Oh, and sort of Karen Bass. And then I'll shift over into qualified immunity, like I talked about before. But I thought that CNN State of the Union news summary was also pretty good, and did talk about the Juneteenth massacre. I was surprised that the Fox News Sunday news summary both mentioned Juneteenth and then also talked about the axe handle massacre in Jacksonville that Trump stumbled onto when he moved his Republican convention to Jacksonville. But otherwise, I think this news summary from Fox News focuses much more on the protests than what the people are protesting. Also, that's the Mark Meredith news summary that's most of this clip. But then Chris Wallace at the beginning says that, like, the George Floyd protests were starting to wane, and then this Atlanta thing happened, and I don't think the George Floyd protests were starting to wane, so I am critical of that particular comment at the beginning of this clip, and I will talk about the rest of the clip a little more after we watch the Fox News Sunday news summary together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. Just as the fury over the killing of George Floyd seemed to be easing, another incident has sparked a new wave of protests and outrage in Atlanta. Breaking overnight, protests shut down a major highway and set fire to a Wendy's, where a black man was shot dead by police as he tried to escape arrest. In a moment, we'll speak with a member of the president's team, Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson. But first, let's bring in Mark Meredith, traveling with the president in Bridgewater, New Jersey. Mark.
Chris, this weekend, protesters marched once again in cities worldwide demanding police departments change their tactics. And now this latest shooting in Atlanta could certainly amplify those calls.
Put your mouth over the mouthpiece, blow as hard as you can until I tell you to stop.
Body camera footage released by Atlanta police shows officers first talking, then trying to arrest 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks Friday night. Moments later, police say they shot Brooks as he attempted to flee. Nearby surveillance video appears to show Brooks running away while pointing what is believed to be a taser at officers.
I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force.
One officer involved has already been fired, and Atlanta's police chief has stepped down. Overnight, the protests in Atlanta turned destructive with a Wendy's restaurant set on fire. The debate over policing powers has already engulfed the 2020 election. On Saturday, the president will restart his campaign rallies with an event in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The rally was pushed back after critics accused the president of being insensitive to Black America for holding it on June 19th, a day honored by many as the end of slavery. This as the RNC resets its convention plans, moving festivities to Jacksonville, Florida from Charlotte, where officials refuse to guarantee allowing a max capacity event due to coronavirus concerns. The location has raised some eyebrows, though, because Jacksonville will be marking 60 years since Axe Handle Saturday, a horrific historic incident when a white mob attacked civil rights demonstrators. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting from Bridgewater. Mark, thank you.
So kudos to Fox News at least for reminding us of Axe Handle Saturday. I mean, in some ways, I'm just embarrassed to live in a country where there is an event that we remember as Axe Handle Saturday, and it's like a racist white mob killing Black Americans. So, at least the Fox News Sunday News Summary covered that. They covered the whole Juneteenth controversy. Not so much his Abe Lincoln thing that he actually said on Fox News. He said a lot of controversial, weird things in his interview there with the Fox News host of Outnumbered, Harris Faulkner. I mean, in some ways she did a good job, like saying, you know, remember, Mr. President, I am a Black woman, and I understand that some of the things you're saying are not good for Black people. I almost thought of making a video about that interview, and actually a little later in the program I'll talk about a possible video I might make about qualified immunity when I get to those clips. But I have a couple more clips, I have 3 newsmaker clips on defunding the police before I get to the qualified immunity clips. Well, 3.5. James Clyburn of South Carolina, Stacey Abrams of Georgia, Ilhan Omar of Minneapolis. Sandy just got up. And by the way, if you're wondering what happened to Dash and Sandy after I was holding up Dash there, here's that's like right over there to my left, in the doorway there. That's but then for some reason Sandy just got up. I don't know why, but anyway, I'm distracting myself from the topic. Well, Dash and Sandy, the puppy and the kitten, are distracting me. I always get distracted by the silliness of the puppy and the kitten, but I want to get to the topic of defunding the police. That was my main topic last week, and it's continuing to be a big topic. You know, last week I talked about how defunding the police, I think, is actually a bridge between the activists on the street and the establishment Democrats, because like I showed the ACLU statement last week, how the ACLU has come out in favor of a letter by the Movement for Black Lives calling for defunding of police and reinvestment in communities. And as a incrementalist, big nonprofit, the ACLU took a big step there by buying into this defund the police talking point. And I saw a lot of comments, and I still see comments on my video from last week and in the live comments this week, saying that defund the police is a losing proposition, a losing slogan. But you'll notice that all of the establishment Democrats, last week I showed Cory Booker coming out against defund the police, and I predicted Joe Biden would not embrace defund the police. The Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, did not go for defund the police. So it's not going to be the slogan of the actual Democratic establishment, but it's an ambiguous term that means different things to different people. It's sort of a bridge between the reformers, and it's, one thing I forgot to talk about last week is the Overton window. I don't know if people are familiar with the term Overton window, but it means what are the topics that are acceptable to the mainstream. I guess that's not the best definition of the Overton window, but it's what are the acceptable topics of debate, what's not too extreme for people to discuss. And defunding the police has been moved into the Overton window in the last couple weeks. That doesn't mean that defunding the police, especially the most radical version of defunding the police, the abolish the police rhetoric, that's actually going to be adopted. But now the middle position has moved to the left, and even the right, even the Republicans are talking about reforming the police. So it's actually been very successful, and I don't think it's going to hurt the establishment Democrats like Joe Biden, who won't say defund the police, but it has helped tie the establishment Democrats to the people on the street. And that's why I think the ACLU took this position, is because they're letting the activists on the street lead. And I noticed Dave Chappelle put out a special, the 8-minute 46-second special, or that's the title, 8:46, unless I am misremembering the number, but I don't think I am. And I almost took a clip of that for my political comedy this week, but it's free on YouTube. Everyone should. It's less than 30 minutes. I didn't put a link to it for my live show, but I'll put a link down in the video description for the recorded show. I believe everyone should watch it since it's free on YouTube. I'm a big fan of Dave Chappelle. I have seen, like I was talking about Bill Maher last week, I've seen Dave Chappelle live several times, including way back in was it 1995 or something in St. Louis, before the Chappelle Show on Comedy Central, when he wasn't famous. I sat in the front row, and I got a little bit of crowd work, had a little conversation with Dave Chappelle. That's one of my claims to, well, not a real claim to fame, but I met Dave Chappelle when he talked to me when he did a small comedy show in St. Louis before he was a big star. And anyway, Dave Chappelle's stand-up comedy, I wouldn't call it like laugh out loud funny, but it was really well woven together. There are these themes that complemented each other that he started and ended with, and they all were, he said it wasn't really well worked out, but I thought it was masterful. And there's more like irony than like silly humor, but it's definitely worth watching, and I'll put a link down in the video description to that for the recorded show viewers. And I kind of got off on a tangent there, but I want to get back to my topic of reforming the police versus defunding the police. And I guess I got off on that tangent because one of the things Dave Chappelle says is that famous people shouldn't be talking about this because the streets are really speaking well for themselves. And for someone who's worked on this issue for many years, abolition of the police is what the activists on the cutting edge have been asking for many years. That doesn't mean it's the right thing, but it's definitely something that if you're following the people who have been working on the issue and thinking about the issue and suffering because of the issue for years and years, that's where you have to start your consideration. And anyway, now I want to get to the newsmakers talking about this. I can't. There's definitely Dash and Sandy interaction going on here. I think, what is going on? I think I have to I tried to video record the Dash and Sandy interaction going on. Dash drove Sandy away, but I only got the last seconds of it. But I'll check out that clip I just got of Dash and Sandy while we watch James Clyburn rejecting defunding the police as too far to the left. But whether it's too far, I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
I want to ask you about the Defund the Police movement, which is an issue in the Democratic Party and the progressive movement right now. Some organizers on the left say that the only way to reduce police violence and police brutality is to slash police budgets, cut the number of officers. One activist, Miriam Kaba, wrote in the New York Times this week, quote, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police. Efforts to solve police violence through liberal reforms like these have failed for nearly a century. Enough. We can't reform the police. Why on earth would we think the same reforms would work now?" Unquote. What is your message to her? What is your message to those in your caucus, the Black caucus, such as Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who we're talking with shortly, who also is saying defund the police?
I will simply say, as I have always said, nobody is going to defund the police. We can restructure the police forces, reimagine policing. That is what we're going to do. The fact of the matter is the police have a role to play. What we've got to do is make sure that their role is one that meets the times, one that responds to these communities that they operate in. I didn't grow up in fear of police, even in a segregated environment. We never feared the police. But all of a sudden now, I do fear the police. The young blacks fear the police. Why? Because we have built in a system that's responding, once again, to Brown v. Board of Education and everything that comes with it. When I was growing up, we didn't have black police. Now, I remember when the first black policeman, remember his name to this day, two of them. One name was Gilliard, one name was China. The fact of the matter is, this is a structure that has been developed that we've got to deconstruct. So I wouldn't say defund, deconstruct our policing.
All right, Majority Whip James Clyburn from South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
So there you can see establishment Democrat James Clyburn, the Democrat from South Carolina who endorsed Joe Biden right before the South Carolina primary and pushed him over the top so that Bernie Sanders, who was almost looked like he was going to be the nominee, and then after South Carolina, that kind of clinched it. Did you just hear Dash there? I actually got the ultimate Dash and Sandy interaction clip during that clip. Do you hear that? Weird things are going on here between Dash and Sandy, but but I want to get back to the defund the police topic. If the cat will let me do that, jeez. Can you all hear that? I'm not just hearing that. It's not imaginary, right? You're hearing the cat in the background. But so James Clyburn said that he rejects defund the police, and the clip after next I'm going to show you is Ilhan Omar, Democrat from Minnesota, responding to that. But in between, I want to show you Stacey Abrams, who's another possible Biden vice presidential pick, trying to sort of bridge the gap between James Clyburn and defunding the police, where she's talking about, and I checked my notes here, both the reformation and transformation of police. which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
There's a conversation happening right now, this whole debate over defunding the police. The Democrats' nominee, Joe Biden, has said he's against defunding the police, but of course is for investing more in social services and other programs. What does defunding the police mean to you, and is it necessary?
I think we're being drawn into this false choice idea. The reality is we need two things. We need reformation of how police officers do their jobs, how law enforcement does its job. Because what happened yesterday to Rayshard Brooks was a function of excessive force and the decision that the fact that they were either embarrassed or panicked led them to murder a man who they knew only had a taser in his hand. We know that the murder of Breonna Taylor means that we have to reform no-knock warrants. We know that in the state of Georgia, we also have to look at the larger judicial issue of the fact that people can use citizen arrest laws to murder men like Ahmaud Arbery in the streets. So reformation is absolutely important. What we saw happen in New York is a part of this. I served in the state legislature for 11 years, and I served on the committee of purview. I took action to increase police accountability. I took action to address the issues of criminal justice reform. But I also know that we have to have a transformation of how we view the role of law enforcement, how we view the construct of public safety, and how we invest not only in the work that we need them to do to protect us, but the work we need to protect and build our communities. And that's the conversation we're having. We'll use different language to describe it, but fundamentally we must have reformation and transformation.
Georgia had a primary election this week. We saw some chaotic.
So, yeah, there's Stacey Abrams, possible Joe Biden vice presidential pick, trying to bridge the gap between defunding the police and reforming the police, saying that we need reformation and transformation. But like I said before, I showed that clip. Here's Ilhan Omar, one of the squad, with AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar, and a couple other of the more progressive Democrats are the squad in the Congress. And here is Ilhan Omar, who comes from Minnesota and actually, I think, from Minneapolis, talking about how defunding the police is actually not such a radical idea, and specifically responding to what James Clyburn said in the clip I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
So let's talk about that, because you've talked about the need to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. What takes its place? If you could just decree what takes its place, who investigates crimes? Who arrests criminals? What happens?
Yeah, so Minneapolis unanimously just voted on a resolution that will engage the community on a one-year process of what happens as we go through the process of dismantling the department and starting anew. A new way forward can't be put in place if we have a department that is having a crisis of credibility, if we have a department that's led by a chief who's suited for racism, if we have a department that hasn't solved homicide. Half of the homicides in Minneapolis Police Department go unsolved. There have been cases where they've destroyed rape kits. And so you can't really reform a department that is rotten to the root. What you can do is rebuild. And so this is our opportunity, as a city, to come together, have the conversation of what public safety looks like, who enforces the most dangerous crimes that take place in our community. And just like San Francisco did, right now they're moving towards a process where there is a separation of the kind of crimes that solicit the help of officers and the kind of crimes that we should have someone else respond to. This is really, you're not saying that just the process of going through this together.
Just to be clear, though, you're not saying that there's nothing that takes its place. You're not saying that if a woman,
absolutely not. I think that's really where the conversation is going wrong, because no one is saying that the community is not going to be kept safe. No one is saying crimes will not be investigated. No one is saying that we are not going to have proper response when community members are in danger. What we are saying is the current infrastructure that exists as policing in our city should not exist anymore. And we can't go about creating a different process with the same infrastructure in place. And so dismantling it and then looking at what funding priorities should look like as we reimagine a new way forward is what needs to happen. And that is truly why you have 13 members unanimously on a city council vote to start this process. And I know that there are many places where a process like this is needed, many places where they might not go through the drastic process of dismantling. But just like in Camden, they realized that there was just a department that was beyond reform as it was. They dismantled it and they figured out a different way to move forward as a community in regards to providing public safety for one another. And that's what needs to happen in Minneapolis, and that's what we're committed to.
So there are a lot of Democrats, as you know, who disagree with.
So, and if you want to watch that whole interview, get the link down in the video description to CNN State of the Union. You can see where Jake Tapper follows up with asking about Democrats like James Clyburn and Joe Biden, who refused to endorse defunding the police. But I think Ilhan Omar there wasn't all that different from Stacey Abrams trying to bridge the gap. That's what I talked about last week, is defund the police, a wedge issue that's going to allow Trump and Republicans to demonize Democrats and win the election in 2020, both presidential and down ballot races. Well, I don't think that's going to happen, especially because the establishment Democrats like Joe Biden and James Clyburn won't say, and even Cory Booker that I showed last week, won't say defund the police. Instead, I think it's more of a bridge between those establishment Democrats and the people on the streets, the activists, the base of the Democratic Party, who have to be excited and activated and come out to vote in November. That's really important to have an activated progressive base. And I think that's what defund the police is about. You can tell me down in the comment section if I'm wrong about that. Oh, and I was reading the live comments during that last clip, and I saw that I got a third Super Chat contribution from Lulu Girl for $9.99 with a thank you GIF. I don't know, is that like a, what animal that is saying thank you? Is it like a chipmunk maybe? I don't know. But I appreciate all the Super Chat contributions, especially because for I think 4 of my last 5 LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundups have ended up being demonetized even after manual review. The last 2 weeks have. I mean, one of the things is YouTube doesn't want to monetize discussions of police misconduct that actually show video of the police misconduct. Like in the news summaries I showed you earlier, there was a lot of video of what happened in Atlanta and that guy who got shot, and that's not something YouTube wants to monetize, I guess, but I still want to show you those clips, especially when that's what the Sunday morning news analysis shows are talking about. And I want to talk about it especially because that's something I've been working on for a long time in my, limited white ally supporter role, I guess, and working as a volunteer activist with the ACLU. But if you've been watching my show for a long time, you know that I have the new Jim Crow over my left shoulder for the whole 7 years. Plus, I've been doing this live stream that's been my anchor because it's a seminal book of the Black Lives Matter movement, in my opinion, my old white guy opinion. But I really like it because Michelle Alexander used to be an ACLU attorney at the ACLU of Northern California, where I've been a volunteer and activist, although all opinions I express on my live stream, of course, are just my own opinions. I have no authority to speak for the ACLU as a lowly volunteer activist. But Michelle Alexander correctly, I think, diagnosed a lot of the problems that are causing these demonstrations for the last 19 days, talking about the racist system of mass incarceration that's both a system of racial control and social control that superseded Jim Crow. When Jim Crow got, the explicitly racist Jim Crow system was outlawed, so they came up with these non-racist terms to reinstitute it, calling people criminals instead of I don't even want to say what they called people in the Jim Crow era, but I think it's really important to read this book. I actually saw one of my viewers messaged me that they finally read this book or listened to it on Audible. Also, the book over here, Chokehold by Paul Butler, that couldn't be more relevant to what happened to George Floyd. And Chokehold is more general about how the criminal justice system is a chokehold on black men. Over here, I have A Colony in a Nation. That's a book by Chris Hayes about the two systems of justice for white people and for black people. Right beyond, here's Ta-Nehisi Coates. He has a couple good books. I put another Ta-Nehisi Coates book over here. I think in the news summary they showed the new Jim Crow in the background, and they also showed can you see Trevor Noah? Oh, Trevor Noah's book is out of the frame, but anyway, my point being that the racism inherent in the system has been a long-term issue, and that seemed to be totally ignored in this questioning by Chris Wallace of Karen Bass, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I thought this was kind of tin-eared questioning by Chris Wallace on Fox News. He seems to be definitely an apologist for the cops who killed that guy in Atlanta. Saying that first that he ran, and what's your reaction to what happened, and anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch Chris Wallace talk to Karen Bass. And this is kind of a transitional clip because Karen Bass talks about defunding the police a little bit, but also about qualified immunity, which is the next topic I want to cover after we watch the clip together over here.
Congresswoman, let's first discuss the Atlanta police shooting that I just discussed with Secretary Carson. The gentleman was clearly resisting arrest. Then he ran away with one of the officers' stun guns. Your reaction to what happened there?
Well, I thought it was so sad. I mean, especially considering why the officers were called to begin with. This man had fallen asleep in a takeout line. Did it really need to escalate to that? So I was just very sad by it.
Well, you say it didn't need to escalate to that, but it did. And I guess the question really becomes, and let's talk about some of your reforms, some of the measures that you call for in your legislation, a ban on chokeholds, lifting qualified immunity to make it easier for people to sue police. In the abstract, on a piece of paper, they may sound perfectly legitimate, but as you saw in the situation in Atlanta, where I agree, it was couldn't have been more nonviolent, a man falling asleep in the drive-through lane at a Wendy's, but it did escalate. Do you worry about tying the hands of police who get into realistic situations in the street where things spin out of control?
No, I don't, and let me explain why, because there's a lot of different parts to the bill. So one of the very significant parts is national standards, training, and accreditation. And we're finding a lot of support from police officers. Yesterday, I had an hour-long meeting with the Fraternal Order of Police, and they are very supportive of the idea of national standards and significant training. You should be accredited to be a police officer. Any profession that allows you to use lethal force, there should be very significant training.
Congresswoman, we've unfortunately see this play out too many times.
So, like I said, that's a transitional clip between the issue of defund versus reform police, but over to this issue of qualified immunity. And I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the issue of qualified immunity, but let me make sure I have the... it comes from federal law, section, or it's 42 USC 1983, 42 US Code 1983, a civil action for deprivation of rights. And I actually know something about this. I've recently taken several seminars on this, but it's basically the law that lets you sue peace officers who under color of authority deprive you of your rights. That could be your Fourth Amendment right to be free from reasonable searches and seizures. So like unreasonable use of force in an arrest, that is a Fourth Amendment violation and a violation of your civil rights. And so you should be able to sue a police officer under 42 USC 1983 that your rights have been violated. But the courts, it's not in the statute. There's nothing in the statute about qualified immunity. It's something that courts came up with on their own, which apparently, supposedly conservatives are supposed to be against. And in fact, like Clarence Thomas, conservative on the Supreme Court, is someone who is skeptical of qualified immunity because it's something courts made up without something in the statute. And what it says is that even though you're supposed to be able to sue police officers for violating your constitutional rights, unless the officer who violated your rights knew that what he was doing was a clearly established, those two words are really important, clearly established violation of your rights, well, then you don't get to sue him. And that means there has to be a case in the past where the courts already decided what that cop did was a violation of your rights. And they do it at this level of specificity where it's not just like use of excessive force. Well, that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, so any cop who does that is liable. No, it's like it has to be the exact facts that happened before and now happen to you. And it's really difficult to get past that. And I want to show Tim Scott first, the one black Republican in the Senate, answering questions about qualified immunity a couple times before I get to Cory Booker making the point that I was just making. But what's really interesting about these next two clips, one from NBC News' Meet the Press, is Chuck Todd, I think, understands qualified immunity, but he doesn't get a great answer out of Tim Scott in the first clip. And then Margaret Brennan says a couple things about qualified immunity that make it seem like she doesn't understand it, but she gets much better answers out of Tim Scott. But I'll start with the NBC News Meet the Press questioning of Tim Scott on qualified immunity, which he doesn't want to see any reforms on that, as I will talk about after we watch that clip together over here.
I want to show here quite a few local and state communities have already enacted reform measures. 6 states have done either the governors have issued executive orders or their legislature has passed some reforms, signed them into law, and a whole bunch of communities that we're going to show in a scroll have, or police departments have instituted different things like a ban on the chokehold. For instance, I know Miami-Dade did that among others. But on the federal level, what has the most momentum here? What is the most consensus? The Democrats want to create a national registry to track police misconduct. They want to end no-knock warrants. You already talked about chokeholds, and they want to reduce qualified immunity for police officers. Of those 4 priorities, and we're going to, like I said, chokeholds, there's a lot of consensus. Where are you in the other 3?
Well, on no-knocks, we certainly want to understand there's no actual database on no-knocks. We don't know when it's used, to whom it's used against. We don't know the race, the sex, the age. We know nothing about no-knocks except for the Breonna Taylor situation that was tragic without question. So I want to take the Breonna Taylor case and have an act that requires more data to be provided so that we can actually come out with policies that are consistent with the best use of no-knocks or the elimination of no-knocks. We just don't have the information to get there. I know that the House bill says let's just eliminate it for drug cases, but we have no information that supports that that is the best way to go. I'm interested in having that conversation. If we get to the end of the road and we have a negotiation, that will be on the table, whether it's a local or state approach on chokeholds, that will be on the table, whether there's a national registry, a state registry, or a local department by department registry around the misconduct, that will be on the table as well. So there are approaches that are very similar and somewhat different at the same time. I think we're going to get to a bill that actually becomes law.
I was just going to say, it seems as if your disputes are more in implementing the goal, implementation to get to the goal, whether it's whether it's financial incentives to encourage change versus mandates. Is that the? Do you think there are more disputes sort of on implementation than on the larger goal?
Well, Chuck, let me just put some skin on that comment you just made. So the House bill reduces money or takes money away from states on the chokehold issue. We take it from the departments, department by department. On the qualified immunity, something that you mentioned, I would be interested in decertification of officers. The left says that's a union issue that's kind of hard to get at. Qualified immunity on the right, that's an issue that most Republicans don't like at all, to include myself. So the question is there a path forward that we take a look at the necessity of eliminating bad behavior within our law enforcement community? Is there a path forward? I think we'll find that. I'm not sure that it's qualified immunity. It seems like it won't be decertification, but there's going to be more information provided to the public so that we can make concrete decisions. But if we're that close on making progress, I hope we don't let partisanship get in the way.
Well, let me ask you about the president and the role he plays here.
So you see Chuck Todd moves on there, and I think Chuck Todd understands what qualified immunity is from his questioning. Margaret Brennan, in this next clip, at the beginning, she seems to think that qualified immunity has something to do with whether officers can be fired, but it has to do with whether they're liable whether they can be held liable when sued, not whether, Fox News keeps talking about whether it means whether they can be personally sued, although a lot of times they're indemnified by their employers even if they are found liable. It's but whether they can be sued at all, whether they personally have to pay or the employer they work for has to pay. Qualified immunity says unless they violate a clearly established law or they clearly established right at a level of specificity where, like, it has to be the exact same thing happened to someone before and a court decided it was against the law and officers know about that. Unless that's the case, then they get qualified immunity. Chuck Todd seemed to understand that, not so much Margaret Brennan, but she got a better answer out of Tim Scott because you'll hear the words poison pill before he says it's like the Republicans are against it. But here in this next clip, he's pretty much saying that if there's changes to qualified immunity, which means that officers can be more easily sued for violating constitutional rights, that means Republicans and the president are going to kill it And Tim Scott says that to Margaret Brennan, even though she doesn't seem to understand qualified immunity at the beginning of the clip or at the end of the clip, as I will talk about with you a little more after we watch the full clip together over here.
Officer misconduct, you've been talking about having information sharing when it comes to hiring. But what about the firing? Democrats in particular emphasize that reducing qualified immunity, making it easier to fire bad cops, needs to be in legislation. Are you open to that?
Well, there are two ways that you could deal with that. From the Republican perspective, and the president has sent the signal that qualified immunity is off the table. They see that as a poison pill. On our side, we could use the decertification of officer, except for the law enforcement unions say that's a poison pill. So we're going to have to find a path that helps us reduce misconduct within the officers. But at the same time, we know that any poison pill in legislation means we get nothing done. That sends a wrong signal, perhaps the worst signal right now in America. I think we're going to have legislation that can be negotiated, that gets us to the place where something becomes law that actually makes a difference. That's got to be our goal.
So to be clear, you personally would be open to reducing immunity but not removing it completely?
No, I think there's a way for us to deal with it. Decertification would be a path that I would be interested in looking at. That is a path that has got a roadblock because I don't have the votes on the other side to make that into law. If we do it right, I think we can reduce the number of times that we're dealing with misconduct on the police departments. If we don't do it right, then we'll have the same situation where there is no law. We can do better than that as a nation, and we will.
We spoke with the Attorney General last Sunday on Face the Nation, and he pointed...
So, like I said, you get poison pill a couple times in that answer from Margaret Brennan, but she doesn't seem to understand... I think it's about dinner time for Sandy, and that's why there's puppy whining over to my left here, but that shouldn't distract me from Tim Scott's claim that, and if you want to know what decertification is, what he's talking about in those last two clips, it's like police officers are supposed to be more professionalized, and they have to be certified and trained, and if they engage in certain types of misconduct, you can't sue them, but they lose their license, so at least they can't be cops anymore, so that should make you feel better, but I don't think if you're the victim of a police officer violating your constitutional rights, the fact that he can't be a police officer anymore, that might be a little bit, but I don't think that's enough. But the person who makes this argument most strongly actually is Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. I showed a clip of him last week, but this actually... I've been thinking about making a video about qualified immunity, and I did a little research, and basically what I wanted to find was some of these really bad cases where courts found, you can't sue the officer for violating your constitutional rights because of the standard of it has to be clearly established, and it has to be to a level of, that the courts have said, to a level of specificity where like the exact same thing happened to someone before, and cops know that it violates your constitutional rights because a court found the exact same thing, the exact same facts before, and if not, then you're out of luck. And Cory Booker at least finds a few bad cases. You can let me know down in the comment section if you would like me to actually do a legal analysis video on qualified immunity where I find some of these bad cases, these three that Cory Booker talks about, and maybe some more, and explain the standard and explain why it's bogus, even from like a conservative strict legal construction standard. You'll see Cory Booker mentions what I said before, that like Clarence Thomas and some strict legal constructionist Republicans think that this is judicial activism because there's nothing about qualified immunity in 42 U.S.C. 1983, the statute that lets you sue police officers for violating your constitutional rights under the color of law. And anyway, I will talk about all of that a little more after we watch this great explanation from Cory Booker. It's actually a little over 5 minutes from CBS News's Face the Nation this morning. And by the way, if you click on the link to CBS News's Face the Nation in the video description, pretty much the whole program is split into clips on their free YouTube channel, including the entire Cory Booker interview, I believe. But this is 5 minutes from that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch his discussion of qualified immunity, including a few of the worst abuses under that system over here.
The broader concern at the federal levels on how to come up with legislation that both sides can get behind. You heard Senator Scott say that when it comes to qualified immunity, the administration has made clear to him that is a poison pill. It cannot be in any kind of legislation. How do you offset the concern of the administration that qualified immunity helps? Well, it's necessary because police need to make split-second decisions, and they can't be thinking twice in a way that inhibits them from doing their job. How do you offset that specific concern?
Well, let's understand that qualified immunity right now is not a Democratic supported thing. Clarence Thomas and conservative Supreme Court justices say that we need to re-examine qualified immunity. Some of my Republican colleagues in the Senate right now have come forward to me and said we need to re-examine qualified immunity. What qualified immunity does in this country is it allows a case in Washington where a pregnant woman, 7 months pregnant, was dragged into a street for not signing a parking ticket and tased 3 times. No accountability. Those police officers were qualified, had qualified immunity. It's a case in Utah where a bicycle rider 100 yards away was shot multiple times by multiple police, and then they claimed it was just mistaken identity. No accountability in terms of qualified immunity. Even in Washington, and even in Oklahoma, a man with pneumonia wandering, stumbling through a hospital, unarmed, was shot and killed by police. So I could go through horrific example after horrific example. We have to ask ourselves as a society, do we want to have a nation where police officers who do really awful things cannot be held accountable to civil rights charges? And that's unacceptable. And so I hear what folks are saying, but when there's so many conservative voices talking about qualified immunity, and when we know that no one in America should be above the law, I think it's time that we change qualified immunity.
What you heard Senator Scott say, though, was the term poison pill, meaning this could sink everything else. What about his idea that he floated there of decertification as a way to reduce officer misconduct?
Well, every American should think to themselves, if your wife or daughter or family member was that pregnant woman who was brought out into the middle of a street for not signing a traffic ticket and tased 3 times, is decertification a real accountability? We are in a nation right now where the sense of what's possible has shifted. The bill that I just did with incredible partners like Kamala Harris and House members, that would have been poison pills just a month ago. This is a moment in American history where there are things in the Republican bill that allow still chokeholds or no-knock warrants, which are being banned right now from Kentucky to New York. This is not a time for lowest common denominator, watered down reforms. It's a time to stop the problem, because if someone's knee is on your neck, you can't take it halfway off and say that that's progress. We have the tools with which to stop people from dying. And any bill should have a ban on racial and religious profiling, called for by George Bush in his first address to Congress.
But are you saying on this one particular issue that you will not sign any bill unless there is a reduction that would allow for it to be easier to prosecute bad cops?
Look, I have witnessed in my life the awful criminal justice system getting worse. From 1980 till now, our incarceration going up 500% in America. And it was part of a compromise bill to liberate thousands of people out of prisons. And so I did the best I can in the first step we did to tear down a system of mass incarceration in which the land of the free has 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth, even though we're only 5% of the globe's population. So do I want progress? Yes. But when you stop short and start talking about finding a bill that's the lowest common denominator, It is meaning that we will revisit this again when another unarmed black person gets killed and the nation erupts. We should be seeking to solve the problem, pushing the bounds of the possible, and getting as big of a coalition as we possibly can.
But you're saying that there is a chance here that this moment you could miss the moment, that Democrats and Republicans won't be able to come to a compromise?
No, I'm saying that we could miss the moment by not solving the problem and ending practices that we know would make a difference to lives. Things like having police misconduct registries open to the public, because sunshine is the best disinfectant. So I'm going to do everything I can in this moment, that is every day, with artists of activism, nonviolent protesters out in the streets every day.
Well, I want to ask you about this moment, because I mean, it's an election year and emotions are already
So it was actually in that clip, and like I said, that was a good explanation from Cory Booker about qualified immunity, about how there are all these cases where terrible things have been done to people, but because of qualified immunity, where you have to show that it was clearly established as a violation of constitutional rights, that, you know, all the officers knew that this specific situation had happened before and a court had found it to be a violation of constitutional rights. And unless it's clearly established to that extent and specificity, you can't sue the officers. And that's about civil liability, whether you can sue them. 42 U.S.C. 1983 is civil liability. It actually isn't criminal liability, which is a lot more difficult. I saw in the live comments when I was watching that clip that one of my YouTube members, Santa Hayes, posted this question. Whether things done under color of authority that are illegal are also criminal. But no, 42 U.S.C. 1983 is civil liability, whether you can sue and get money for violation of your civil rights. It's actually a lot harder to get criminal liability. That means you have to prove that the officer committed a crime like murder or manslaughter, and that you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt under the criminal law, and that has to do with changes to use of force and justification for use of force, and that's a whole other topic not having to do with qualified immunity. But I appreciate that question from Santa Hayes, and Santa is one of my YouTube members. If you click that join button under the video, you can become a monthly YouTube member. There's also a link down in the video description to become a Patreon patron, which is a monthly member. That's another way to support my videos, in addition to those super chat contributions that I saw along the way. And I think I just got a new one there from Michael Dean Ballard, checking to see if my live chat is in sync with the live video. Chat with clip UC, please. Love to LV and all LV people. So thanks to Michael Dean Ballard. I saw Mary Waney also gave a $10 contribution, saying my service is invaluable. So thanks to the super chat contributions, thanks to my YouTube channel members who click on that join button down there. But I want to move on to my final topic, the few clips I have on the COVID-19 topic, which I think is going to become bigger and bigger. You know, last week I was talking about how I've been watching all the protest videos on, you know, the George Floyd protests, and I see here in Sacramento, I watched the videos, and at the beginning, I think like 90 to 95% of the people were at least wearing masks, but they weren't social distancing. But like hours into the protest, it was maybe like 50 or 60% of people were wearing masks, because you can't wear the mask out in the heat for that long. And of course, all the states are opening up, and including states where cases are increasing, and cases are increasing in a lot of places. And I think that the COVID-19 story is not over, and I think it's going to become bigger and bigger. And first, I'm going to show you a couple news summaries. You know, I talked about how CBS at least incorporated COVID-19 into their news summary. Well, I'm going to show you NBC and Fox News also talking about COVID-19. First, starting with NBC News' Meet the Press for a brief news summary later in the program that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Welcome back. The CDC and the White House Coronavirus Task Force aren't talking about it much, but the United States is in the midst of another surge of COVID-19 cases. 25 states and Puerto Rico have seen spikes of more than 10% over the last 2 weeks. Overall, we have seen more than 2 million confirmed cases in the United States, and 116,000 people have died since February. What does this all mean for the hopes of getting back to something approaching normal in the near future? Joining me now are we're seeing spikes in states across the country. We've broken it up by region here, and you can clearly see the Northeast and the Midwest, those curves are going down, but when you break it up in the South and the West, both of those curves are going up. What does this tell you, Dr. Bedelia, about what the rest of this summer is going to look like?
And like I said, that was just sort of the couple clips from a later part of NBC News' Meet the Press that I edited together to show you there was some coverage of how the spikes in COVID-19 don't look good. And even here locally, in Sacramento, I've been seeing reporters talking about the reopening this week, how they're like people packed into the bars and not wearing masks, and people are just cavalier about. We have not solved this problem, and that was also covered on, of all places, Fox News Sunday, where Chris Wallace had on an epidemiologist to talk about this. And I won't show you what the epidemiologist said, but I will show you about 90 seconds of Chris Wallace introducing and then asking questions of the epidemiologist that made it pretty clear that things are not solved in the COVID-19 area, as you can see, like I said, in this clip.
There are new concerns about a rise in coronavirus cases as states continue to reopen. Some 14 states across the country, including California, Texas, and Florida, reporting case increases of 25% or more in just the past week. Joining us now, some people, Doctor, have suggested that the reason we're seeing more cases is because we're doing more testing, but it isn't just new cases. I want to put some numbers up on the screen. 5 states have seen at least a 35% increase in hospitalization since Memorial Day, and the CDC projects the deaths will jump from 115,000 now to between 124 and 140,000 by July 4th. How much of this do you attribute to states reopening and people easing up on social distancing? And do you think, when you see this increase in hospitalizations and deaths, that some states should consider pulling back on reopening?
Well, what we have to understand is that about 5% of the U.S. population has been infected to date with this virus, some locations slightly higher. This virus is not going to rest until it gets to about 60 or 70%. When I say rest, I mean just slow down.
And that's enough of their epidemiologists to show you that we're only at 5%, and what we need is 60 to 70% immunity to get to herd immunity. And that either means the virus is going to infect 60 to 70% of the people in the United States, or maybe we'll get a vaccine before then and inoculate people, and the vaccine will work. And it's not even clearly established that having had the virus makes you immune to the virus, and that's an important fact to establish. So there are many facts to establish before we know that we're beyond the COVID-19 crisis that dominated my Sunday Live clip roundups for many weeks, and I think we're not through with that, and it's going to go even past the November election, but it's going to be until there's a vaccine that can be distributed and put into actual human beings to get to 60 to 70% immunity, herd immunity in the population. That's either going to happen through a vaccine or through enough people getting the disease and being immune, or if getting the disease doesn't make you immune, then we're basically screwed and we're at the zombie apocalypse, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, the final clip I want to show you is sort of the insidious background to COVID-19. There were these huge $1 trillion relief packages passed by the Congress, and the Congress in the PPP program actually put a inspector general over the program to see where the money was going, and that person was fired by the Trump administration. But the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, said, "Don't worry, there's going to be full transparency on where the money goes." Well, it turns out he doesn't want to tell anyone where all that money went. And this is kind of a clip that, in my personal opinion, both talks about the coronavirus COVID-19 topic, but also the protests and what Fox News really concentrates on, the riots and the looting. Well, it seems like millions of dollars may have been looted by huge corporations, and the Trump administration doesn't want to tell us about it. But this is actually the clip of the week where Jake Tapper is making that very clear. And then at the very end of the clip, he even talks about how we might all be screwed in terms of COVID-19. In the final news clip I will talk about with you a little bit more after we watch together over here.
In a recession. You brought up the PPP.
Oh, and the person he's questioning is the White House economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, who does all he can to dodge the questioning in the final news clip over here.
In a recession. You brought up the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided loans to companies to keep people employed. Secretary Mnuchin originally promised full transparency about who was receiving these loans during the crisis. But this past week, he reversed course, and he said the government would not release the names of those companies. Now, look, I can understand why the Trump administration might think that a company that receives a $25,000 loan doesn't need that information released. I get that. But some companies are getting millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. Don't the American people have a right to know where their money is going?
Well, look, I think in terms of those that shouldn't have qualified, a lot of them have returned the money, and some of those have been named. But I think when Secretary Mnuchin talked about transparency, he talked about the transparency of the process of making the evaluation for the loan and then the distribution of the loan. By the way, for what it's worth, the Congressional Budget Office just put out a report complimenting the Treasury and the administration for getting all these forms of assistance out in a very rapid time. There's been nothing like its biggest rescue in American history, and the efficacious distribution, the whole system, which is transparent. There is an IG that's going to watch over that. That's what the Secretary is talking about. You know,
he
we
said
have
we
a
will be
tradition,
reporting to the public.
whether
No,
it's the
sir,
Federal
I'm sorry.
Reserve.
He said we would report to the public. That's what he said. We will be reporting to the public. That's us, the American people, and we have a right to know where these tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars have gone. If there's no problem with it, if everything's fine with it, great. But I mean, otherwise, it is about as swampy a deal as I can ever imagine. The government giving out hundreds of millions of dollars, and the American people don't even get to know who got it.
Well, I don't know that I would judge it that way. I don't think it was sloppy. Again, I repeat, the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, said this is the most efficient distribution of emergency rescue funds ever. All right, that's the CBO. That's nonpartisan, Jake. Now, insofar as naming each and every company, I don't think that promise was ever made. And I don't think it's necessary. I think what is necessary is to make sure that the legalities were observed, that the process process of credit and lending was observed, and that people who could qualify will in fact get it. There are appeals. We've sent out about $510 billion, and it has, judging by the jobs numbers, which surprised everybody on the upside, 3 million new jobs in May, it has worked. It's probably one of the most successful rescue packages in American history. So I'm afraid I push back on that just a little bit.
He said we will have full transparency in everything we do, and now the administration is backtracking on that. And I understand again.
Well,
that maybe some of the companies $25,000 loan. You don't need to get that. You don't need to explain, why that local business got
that. That's
correct. But the big.
That's exactly right.
But the big loans, the big companies, more than $500,000. I think the American people have a right to know.
Well, I don't know that. Look, again, there's a certain privacy element here. That's the way business operates. I'm going to let Secretary Mnuchin, who in my judgment has done a brilliant job administering this program and creating this program with bipartisan support, I will let him make whatever technical adjustments he needs to make. As you know, we worked with Congress. The president signed a bill last Friday that would lengthen the time period to 24 weeks and reduce the payroll protection to 60% of the loan, so that'll give them more room for overhead. Look, this economy is now in the recovery phase. That's the key point I want to make this morning. We're going to get big retail sales, department store sales, general merchandise sales. We've always had online sales. Again, mortgages are going up. People are buying new homes. New businesses applications are going up. Existing business, small business, almost 80% and rising, according to the Chamber of Commerce. And I want to say, Jake, I think there's a very good chance you are going to get the V-shaped recovery. And I think the second half of the year, referencing the CBO and others, will be a good 20% economic growth. The unemployment rate will fall, and 2021 is going to be another solid year.
I hope you are right. I think there is a lot of concern that because coronavirus is still a pandemic, there are projections that we're going to lose up to 200,000 Americans by September, that perhaps there is going to have to be a retraction in some states because the approach has seemed to be in too many places, let's just go back to work, let's just not social distance, let's not wear masks, and that is ultimately going to hurt the economy again, as some companies and some cities have to retract and reinstitute guidelines. Is that not a concern?
Well,
and Larry Kudlow does actually at least admit that there might be some problems with COVID-19 based on that follow-up question from Jake Tapper, which, I think he did. Like I said, that was the clip of the week because Jake Tapper not only cross-examined Larry Kudlow about, like I said, the people worry about looting of a TV set or looting in some locality where there are protests, that somebody might steal something from a local store, but there are like millions and millions of dollars being looted from the PPP program by these large corporations, where the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, said there would be complete transparency, but now, we don't get to know where any of that money went. Is that looting? I think that qualifies as looting. So I wanted to make that point before I finish the program. And then also, you notice Jake Tapper at the end of that clip made the point that I was making before when I started this topic, saying that the COVID-19 crisis is not over. There are a lot of spikes, that things, 200,000 deaths by September, or 120,000 deaths by July 4th, or somehow, I don't know if this whole race war is race war. We aren't in the middle of a real race war, but if the Trump administration is actually trying to stoke the so-called race war to hide the fact that we're going from 100,000 to 200,000 dead Americans in the COVID-19 crisis, is that what's happening? If you remember, if you were watching my live clip Roundup weeks ago, I was talking about how It was ridiculous of Trump to say that 100,000 dead Americans was an accomplishment, and now it's going to be 200,000. Anyway, that is pretty scary. But anyway, that was the last news clip. I did want to thank my Super Chat contributors one more time. I saw, here's like all of the ones I could capture during the show. Wait, let's see here. So thank you for that, and thank you, Matt. I think, didn't Matt just sign up as a Patreon patron and then also had the first and last Super Chat contributions, unless I'm confusing two different people? But I appreciate all the financial support, especially because YouTube thinks what I'm saying is too controversial to monetize most of the weeks. But I did promise at the beginning of the broadcast that I was going to show you this 42-second clip of Dash and Sandy, but then later during the program I said I had the ultimate Dash and Sandy interaction clip that happened right over there. So before I finish the program, I feel I have promised you both those clips. So first, here is Dash and Sandy early this morning when I fed Dash and Sandy. And I will explain to you what happens in this clip a little more after we watch it together over here. So that was from early this morning when I fed Sandy, and Dash always tags along and tries to get the stray dog kibble bit, and you saw at the end of the clip there that Dash actually got a spare dog kibble bit, but if you were paying attention. But that was the Dash and Sandy clip, the dandy clip as it were, that I promised to show you at the beginning of the broadcast. But during the broadcast, you saw that I picked up Dash and showed Dash to you, and I talked about how there was all this Dash and Sandy interaction right over there. I missed Dash actually bonking Sandy in the nose with his cat claw, but I did get a little Dash and Sandy interaction that I will show you in the final clip tonight over here. And that's the bonus Dash and Sandy interaction clip. I've gone way over time. I hope you appreciate how I spent this Sunday and every Sunday for the last 7+ years watching the Sunday morning news analysis shows, picking out the best clips, adding my media criticism and political commentary, and of course my Dash and Sandy clips. And I will be continuing to do that for the rest of this year at least, and I look forward to seeing you next week, or until I have a chance to upload some other kind of video. But if that doesn't happen, of course I will see you this week and every Sunday for the rest of 2020 at least. And until next Sunday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.